Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Caitlin Miller, and I'm excited to welcome you all to the latest discussion in CTIA's Building the 5G Economy webinar series. Our program will be taking a closer look at the intersection of 5G and transportation with a panel of experts who are quite literally driving the future of mobility. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a second to set the stage for today's discussion and talk about why we're here. 5G. 5G connectivity is enabling some of the biggest opportunities in smart transportation today. From connected vehicle to everything infrastructure and AI-enabled navigation systems to driverless cars and autonomous vehicles, 5G is redefining how people get from one place to another. These use cases will make our roads safer and more accessible for all, generate billions of dollars in cost savings every year, and help reduce our carbon footprint up to 86 million metric tons by 2025. That's the equivalent of removing 72 million passenger vehicles from the road in just 1 year. With 5G networks deployed nationwide, we are seeing transformative technologies take hold in communities across the country. This isn't just the technology of tomorrow, it's already here today. For example, just a few months ago, I was riding down the street in the city of Peachtree Corners, Georgia, in a fully autonomous shuttle enabled by 5G. And let me tell you, it was a really cool experience. In order for us to get from where we are now to a future where 5G-enabled transportation solutions are ingrained in our daily lives, our wireless networks and the licensed spectrum they depend on are the key. And as you'll hear from our program today, that future is not too far down the road. So without further delay, let me welcome our panelists. I'm pleased to be joined today by Joe Moy, CEO of Beep, and Greg McGuire, Managing Director of M-City. We're so glad to have you both here today.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Couldn't be more excited. And Greg, glad to spend some time with you as well. So thanks for the opportunity.
Likewise, Joe, Caitlin. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've had the pleasure of hearing both of you talk about the exciting work your organizations are doing to advance 5G-enabled mobility, and I think that would be a good place for us to start for our audience today with a brief introduction. Joe, if I can start with you, why don't you introduce us to Beep and share a little bit more about how 5G is helping expand your solutions?
Yeah, certainly. So Beep specializes in the deployment and management of first mile, last mile use cases of electric, autonomous, shared platforms. So shuttle form factors that, solve for some of the micro transit gaps that we have in our country, moving 12 to 14 passengers in these use cases that are typically in campus type environments and downtown urban cores where we're really trying to extend mobility and advance the use of these autonomous technologies in ways that are providing meaningful transportation solutions to public and private communities. As it relates to 5G, I would say 5G enablement is absolutely critical to what we're doing to take kind of the current generation of autonomous vehicles, into what's characterized in industry as these level 4 type platforms and level 5 type platforms where you don't necessarily have an attended vehicle in more of these test use cases, and things like the importance of being able to connect with very low latency for tele-assist purposes, for live video monitoring, for interfacing with these vehicles and the connected universe of traffic signals and crosswalks and emergency signals and things of that nature, so that we've got kind of a real-time view of what's going on, how we're interfacing with the various technologies, and ultimately enhancing and ensuring the safety and performance of these types of mobility solutions.
That's fantastic. And there's a couple of good points in there that I want to get back to in just a second. But Greg, let's turn to you. I know there's some exciting things happening in Ann Arbor. So why don't you give us a glimpse into M-City and talk a little bit about how 5G is an important part of the connectivity ecosystem there.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. So M-City's been around for about 7 years now, but the connected vehicle work at the University of Michigan here has been around 2-3 times longer than that. I would say, M-City was built as this public-private partnership here at the University of Michigan, really to tackle the ways in which technology can be applied to transportation for all of the important reasons of improving safety, efficiency, equity, and access, that we just talked about. I think, connectivity, really marches forward with the rest of society, and the opportunities for transportation to take advantage of those changes is no different than in other areas. At MCity, we built really the largest production connected vehicle environment with the Transportation Research Institute here at U of M, starting about 15 years ago. And that research has evolved significantly over the years, especially as newer technologies like 5G have come along, that have really opened the ability to use the telecommunications networks for safety-based cases. And that's where we're at today, is actually demonstrating with our membership partners, the ability to use these networks for safety reasons, which can help close that gap in automation use cases. It can help make human drivers safer, and it can help actually improve the safety of other road users, whether or not you're carrying a cell phone or not. There's plenty of opportunity there. Those are the kinds of things that we're working on here at MCity.
That's fantastic. And I think my next question kind of expands on what you both have started to talk about. But since we have folks tuning in today from all over the country, I want to talk a little bit about scaling these technologies and really what some of the opportunities and challenges are there. Joe, maybe if we can start with you and Greg chime in as well. Let's talk maybe about some of the barriers that exist and what we need to do to collectively work through those to reach nationwide scalability. And then, of course, if we can just kind of add, how 5G helps us get there.
Certainly, there's a lot of opportunities in front of us as it relates to the whole regulatory side of how we, further deploy and gain ridership in these types of autonomous platforms. We're unique in that we're focused on this kind of multi-passenger, more controlled speed type use cases. And as I described, these first mile, last mile scenarios. And that's got some advantages, certainly, in that, in controlled speeds and environments, you've got the ability to consume more quickly, process more, and respond to the various scenarios that we have out there with shared roadway users and other obstacles and things that happen that a human would typically perceive. So I think certainly the advancement of 5G, as I hit on several things that we're testing and utilizing to improve the performance and safety of these vehicles, are very critical to scale. I think for autonomous vehicles to be more broadly adopted, in my humble opinion, we've got to really think about the removal of a driver and a person of authority. If you're supporting public transit, as an example, and there's no longer a physical driver on the vehicle, well, how do you communicate with passengers? How do you provide a safe experience? How do you interface at any time on a moment's notice, depending on what may happen on a vehicle, whether it's a medical emergency, whether it's some type of issue with a technology that needs to be, go through a troubleshoot process, or whether it's just general communication and monitoring of the passengers and their well-being on vehicles. That is so critical. And, a lot of ways, I think our industry kind of jumped from level 3 attended vehicles to these level 5 platforms and forgot about this area called level 4 that is so critical to create, I'll say a virtual drive or a virtual experience that replaces kind of some of the importance that is represented in, how a driver assists and communicates with passengers today. And that's a big piece of what we're developing as a company. And as I describe that, you can imagine the importance of reliable, high-speed transit for communicating and capturing the video and doing the things I described we need to do in more of a virtual attendant type capacity. So I'd say that's one of the biggest areas of opportunity in front of us.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, I think of, 5G has got this, it's kind of a whole grab bag of standards improvements, right? And I think of, in the shorthand in my head, I think of 5G as kind of a 10x improvement in all areas. It's got the ability to have kind of 10 times the bandwidth, sure. And that's the thing that gets pressed, but 10 times reduction in latency is really interesting. The 10x device density and reduction in power requirements and cost is also pretty interesting. And so, you can start to look at 5G as a way to enable, ubiquitous and cheap roadside sensors. And so, we just talked about the ability to do good teleoperation for these so-called structured autonomy cases, but cases where you can kind of constrain the deployed environment enough that it's quite safe to deploy these systems today, whether it's goods delivery or human transport. But I think there's also opportunity to use these systems for things like flood monitoring, for roadway use, and of course this extra relevant today due to California's recent storms. But the ability to also bring infrastructure in, as Joe mentioned, I think the ability to put very high quality and really high computation systems in touch with the information coming from intersections, where incidentally a little under half of our fatal crashes in the United States occur every year. If you can couple that with the ubiquity of cloud compute, you can do all kinds of interesting things with safety. And so, those are the things I think about with this. I think I also like to think about the fact that, in some cases, having this technology available unlocks all kinds of uses that we haven't even thought of. So we've got some ideas that we're trying to put forward. But one of the most interesting things, and why one of our member companies, Verizon, has deployed a full C-band millimeter wave 5G system here in our outdoor test facility, is all the things we haven't thought of. And setting our academic partners loose. And it's not just the University of Michigan. MCity is actually available through the National Science Foundation for nationwide use. It's setting those great brains loose on other barriers that we haven't even explored. So that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as I'm concerned.
And actually, Greg, if I can stay with you and expand on that a little bit, and also go back to a point you mentioned earlier about public-private partnerships. And Joe, feel free to add to this as well. But let's talk a little bit about how public-private partnerships can help sort of overcome these barriers. You were alluding to it a little bit, but would love to talk about the role there and maybe some more opportunities specifically in that space.
For one, public-private partnerships are great at that pre-standards work. There are certainly areas for which you have to have standards, or else the state of the industry can't move forward. And 5G, of course, is a set of standards. That's pretty understandable, I think. But let's consider the AV use cases that Joe was just talking about. If we're going to take safety data and broadcast it out over cellular systems to nearby vehicles, whether they're human operated or machine operated, those messages have to transit various carrier networks, and so the carriers have to work together to make sure that safety critical messages aren't dropped. So those are the kinds of things that I think public-private partnerships are excellent for, where you need to bring together a cross-industry approach. And at MCity, for example, we need automakers, folks who are building these AVs. We need Beep. We need the telecommunications carriers, and that's why we've got Verizon here. We need other standards bodies like 5GAA and SAE, who are going to eventually be the ones tasked with coming up with these standards. But that's kind of the key thing for us. Verification, validation of self-driving cars is another good one. That's some of the stuff that we work on here. Who's going to set those standards? Whether they end up in a self-certification or government regulatory environment, the industry still needs to have a set of rules that they're working towards. And I think there's cases where nobody wants to be the one group developing it in isolation. Maybe you've thought of everything, maybe you haven't. You want to do that as a consortium, and that's where I see the value of public-private.
Yeah, I mean, Greg, you hit on a lot of great points in there. And, first, let me commend you and the great work that's going on at M-City. I had an opportunity to visit there last year, and I think it's a great representation of why it's so important to leverage all the different types of testing and validation that are going on across industry. We as a business are focused on moving people and solving for some of the mobility challenges that we have in our country, whether that's equity, whether that's accessibility, whether that is, providing transportation in use cases we don't serve in many urban corridors. But the reality of it is that the technologies that we are testing at all levels of industry, whether we're moving people, packages, warehousing implementations, agricultural implementations, so much can be learned from these various autonomous technologies that are out there being proven out in various use cases. So the aggregation of all this testing, the sharing of data and information is so critical to advancing, our collective success. And candidly, as a country, we're falling behind in some areas because of slower changes in regulation and other things that somewhat stymie our ability to prove out more advanced adoption of these types of in our case, again, people movement. But again, I think, from a P3 perspective, you can't say enough about all the testing that's going on in municipalities with transit authorities and in institutions like M-City, where I think all of those collective experiences help us each improve our ability to deliver, again, autonomous services regardless of the flavor of what we're moving. And that's going to be an important part of the long-term success of what we're doing. It's interesting as I look across the various industries that I've been associated with for we'll just say several decades. We'll leave it at that. But usually you have this competition where you don't want to share information because you want a competitive advantage to achieve this or achieve that. Well, every negative incident we have in autonomy, we all suffer from. So there's a lot of motivation to succeed together. And I think, the great work that's been done in public-private partnerships is a good example of the importance of how we advance everything that we're doing across this whole autonomous sector. And ultimately what we've hit on as far as the 5G arena and how that enables the use and the broader use and extensive use of these in a much more comprehensive and safe environment is absolutely an important tenet to that success.
I'll add one final thing on there, which is I think public-private has the ability to make sure that you've got a full multidisciplinary approach, especially in the academic arena. We're working on engineering and technical things, but, the sociology, the psychology, the human factors, the law, these are all critical areas that can't be overlooked if these technologies are going to be used in successful ways for the benefit of society. And, we've got a project right now, for example, where we're looking at, it's Professor Alex Murphy, who's a sociology professor here at U of M. She's working on this idea of transportation security and, measuring a person's access to reliable transportation. And I think, that's kind of groundwork that you need then before you work on interventions like what Joe is building for BEEP. He wants to be able to know, where is the area of need, is our solution having the intended effect and improving reliability of access to jobs and food and, all the things that follow from being able to freely move around. And so, that's a base kind of measure, but it's so critical But it's one of those examples of things that I think, an individual company might not be interested in measuring alone, or it's just not feasible. But we can do it as a PPP.
That's great. And actually want to just kind of roll with the point you were making there about some of these kind of broader impacts that we see in moving people from one place to another. And let's talk maybe a little bit about some of those positive impacts, maybe specifically as we look at the autonomous technology space, either in the communities, Joe, that you're deployed in, or, with some of the test concepts that you're proving out there in M-City. Would love to just talk about kind of that broader impact of mobility.
Yeah, and I'm happy to start with that. We've just to kind of put it in perspective, we've had, I think over 25 now public road deployments across 6 states where, what we focus on very intently is not just, proving out of the technology and the leverage of what we've discussed here in the connected arena that's going to be so critical to the advancement of these autonomous platforms, but it's also around meaningful mobility use cases. How do we make sure that we're providing a type of service that is solving for a gap that we've got in transportation? A lot of people are concerned that autonomous platforms are going to replace bus drivers all across our country, and certainly these technologies have some great advantages, in all forms of transportation, but I would argue it's going to start with utilizing incremental platforms that ultimately extend mobility and don't replace mobility. That's really what we're trying to do. We've got to, whether it's, your goals on the environmental side of the house, or whether it's your goals on the mobility equity side of the house, or anything in between, we're not going to solve for that one car at a time. We've got to change the way we embrace, transportation, and public transportation in particular, very differently. There's pockets of these in our country where public transportation has a bit of a negative stigma to it. There's other areas where it's utilized by everyone, in a community or city. And, we've got to get much more comfortable utilizing alternatives to our personal vehicles and extending mobility to those that don't have access to personal vehicles. And that's really where, in my opinion, you're going to see the biggest impact in all of these areas. We're not going to solve for carbon emissions, one combustion engine vehicle at a time being replaced by an electric vehicle. It's going to be taking 6 or 7 vehicles off the road for each route that you service in a meaningful, safe, and convenient alternative form of electric mobility in public and private communities. So I think in my mind, as I look at the various use cases that we've been able to serve, some of it is in residential communities accessing, the various goods and services, be they health services, be they retail type services, or restaurant type areas. It's creating that connectivity that give a true alternative means of transportation to your personal vehicles. It's eliminating the requirements for parking. It's removing road congestion. We've done very focused pilots around our ADA community. How do we make sure that these vehicles, are able to provide the necessary access for, those of all abilities? And you think about that particular topic. And I go back to my previous example. Once a person of authority is removed from a driver's seat, if you will, how do you assist somebody in tying down a wheelchair? You're going to need automation to do that. And those are the types of technologies that need to come along, with the autonomous vehicles themselves, whether it's visually impaired or hearing impaired, or those, bound to wheelchairs or other types of walking devices. How do you make sure that we're creating everything that's necessary to be able to support that type of access within, the vehicle itself, and in a way that's safe and secure? And that's where I think it gets really exciting. It goes beyond just the vehicle and what we're talking about in a connected world to so many things that are going to be critical to supporting the various, use cases that we're not only testing today, but, got an opportunity to expand to much more broadly.
I want to touch on that a little bit. From my own personal perspective, I come from a world of car sharing 20 some odd years ago when, we took some vehicle technology and connected it to the internet for the first time. And, just having kind of a network of knowledge of vehicles around a city, you could start to direct people to things that were free, and it was a better, much more efficient use of resources. And that was technology called CDPD, which is, you were buying kilobytes worth of data at a time. It sounds quaint to talk about it now. That was only 25 years ago. And, I think about 5G, and I think about the sort of network effects that all of this ubiquitous data collection and availability will have. A lot of the autonomy enabling cases that we're doing now are precisely what Joe is talking about, where you're taking public transit system and you're augmenting it with ride hail or the availability of goods delivery hubs and micromobility transit hubs. But you've got all of this information coming in from all of these different sources, and it can be now aggregated and analyzed in real time in a lot of cases. And cities can make that data available much more cheaply than they could before. Those are the kinds of things that unlock very interesting use cases in my mind. I think, from the accessibility standpoint that Joe just mentioned, look at the parallel of assistive devices that has happened with the cellular phone industry. Smartphones have taken over a huge number of those devices that used to be very expensive, and now the latest Apple iPhone or Android phone, the assistive technologies on there are really incredible, from translation to automatic sign reading and all kinds of things. And so for example, for the 8 million Americans, our fellow citizens who are blind or have low vision, which includes, for example, my son. The ability to use the transportation systems, whether it's a personally owned car or public transit, whatever. They're very different than what I take for granted, for example. And I think the ability to provide the same freedom of mobility that I enjoy for the rest of this country is one of the key reasons for why we're doing this. And that's what we're working towards here at MCity. So, the ways in which these technologies can help lower those barriers is really incredible. And, you'll see that continue. We'll be talking about 6G here, I'm sure, in a few more years at the next CTIA. But that's the key piece, right, is that inevitable movement forward that opens up all of these different avenues.
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about that movement forward. And as we look ahead at kind of this mobility for all, would love to hear both of your thoughts on what do you think the transportation sector will look like. Let's maybe look ahead to the next decade. And you've kind of alluded to this already, but I think connectivity plays a big factor there. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Greg hit on some really good points that I'll just reinforce. You think about, and I'll look at it at the most basic level, and that's providing, the services that people count on today in public transportation. One is I look at things like, scheduled times and stops, right? You pick me up here at 3:00 and I get there by 3:30. The typical routes, the typical schedules, and the lack of on-demand or, ride hailing or however you want to characterize it, but the flexibility to have services like are provided for, in the shared mobility options that we've got, and providing that within public transit itself. So as simple as that is, I think changing from these demand models, and we all see it, how many buses do you drive by in a day that are empty because that route runs all day long and it's really only utilized from 8 to 10 in the morning and 4 to 6 in the afternoon. And so much more demand planning, much more orchestration of assets and fleets the ability to be much more dynamic in your planning of public transportation. So you've got the vehicles available in specific locations when they're most needed and most in demand. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages that'll create a level of adoption where people feel much more comfortable utilizing it. Not all of us can work on fixed schedules. I'll speak for myself anyways, as I'll probably run over on this call, right? Um, but any event, I think that's, just changing the way we think of public transportation in the area of kind of convenience and availability and affordability. I think, the other example I'll use as it relates to how we're going to transform where our investments are going from a public transit perspective is a lot of the platforms that, we're talking about here in the case of, we'll use this shuttle form factor. Well, these vehicles are going to be able to operate very efficiently and very effectively on existing road infrastructure. You look at the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that have to go into an above grade, rail structure or even an in-ground rail structure and some of the other forms of transportation that are provided in downtown areas. The ability to now operate on existing infrastructure will save hundreds of millions of dollars, city to city, depending on what types of services they're looking to expand and provide. We're looking at projects at like one with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, where they're going to be modernizing an old rail structure to be able to use it for, these driven vehicles and really changing the way they're able to move people around above grade and at grade in that example to really extend mobility out to some of the underserved areas in the downtown arena that aren't able to access the goods and services in the downtown Jacksonville today. So a lot of exciting things going on. I would highlight kind of the two biggest changes is thinking very differently about the infrastructure that's required to dramatically extend mobility. And then secondly, this whole idea of creating a more convenient kind of on demand and really optimized use of the assets to make it much more accessible for many more people.
I think that's a key thing. The optimizing use is really one of the incredible opportunities here, and you can only do that with data, and I think the data will flow from connected devices and connected systems. I look at, caveat, I'm a terrible futurist, so what's going to happen in the next 10 years is a tough one for me. But I think, in my head, that ubiquity of data collection becomes really valuable, and we figure out ways of actually processing and turning that into useful action. I think the ability to connect intersections and other, high crash areas in the United States with powerful sensors that now can stream data without having to go dig up the roads and lay network, allows us to take on some of the, safety problems that we have in our road infrastructure. So I'd love to see in 10 years us using, near miss analytics as a way of improving safety in road segments rather than waiting, several years for crash data from police reporting law enforcement agencies. We can be much more real time about potential road configuration changes. I'd like to see, ubiquity of payment systems across different modes, so that that's all going to take network connectivity, I think, to make most of that happen. But whether I'm using I think, and Joe just mentioned this, a bus, public transit, subway, or ride hail, or a scooter, or whatever, if that's all seamless, then that lets us really truly connect those systems together in a more useful way. And I'd like to see a measure of the mobility security of every American, so that we know where to work on intervention, and we have a way of measuring, how these mode changes and technology improvements are helping, or areas in which they could help. Those are things I would like to see, and I think, 10 years from now, if that all happens, we're going to be using 5G for not just watching Netflix. We're going to be using it for all kinds of safety cases in transportation, for significantly improved efficiency of our fleets and of our passenger vehicles, and other transportation modes. We're going to have made a much more equitable system, and one that's accessible by every American, which is the dream. I think, as Joe said.
Greg, you hit on something I'd love to add a little bit more onto, just because it's a great example of the importance of how we utilize the data that is coming out of these vehicles and these roadway use cases to ultimately change the way we do a lot of things in our world. You also use the example of the the public safety arena. And I think of our law enforcement community. We had the opportunity to work with a team from the Florida Highway Patrol, where we did a bit of a workshop on, what type of data analytics are they going to be looking at in the future in investigating an accident or an incident. Today you go out and you measure, how far are the skid marks on a roadway, and, you take eyewitness testimony and you put all that together and you formulate what happened in an intersection, with hopefully just a fender bender. Well, fast forward, you got the perfect eyewitness in your system itself, and all the data and both, the log data as well as the video data to be able to recreate exactly what happened, when it happened, how the vehicles responded. And, if you think about that from a law enforcement perspective, fast forward 10 years, we're going to have a lot more skills in the data analysis arena versus, the roadway investigation arena. And so it's nice to see, key groups, across the entire sector that interface with what happens on our roadways, thinking about how do we prepare for those realities here, which are not that far away. And so I think your point about data is a real key one, and it affects so many things that are going to be happening on our roadways.
Well, I would actually love to keep this conversation going all afternoon if we could, but just knowing we're coming up on time, I'd love to sneak in one more question, and it wouldn't be a CTIA event if we didn't end on a 5G note. So, Joe, let's maybe start with you, and Greg, you can take it home. What's one thing that you're most excited about in terms of 5G-enabled mobility?
Yeah, and I'm going to probably repeat a little bit of what I talked about earlier, but I think it's important. I think 5G is really going to be one of the most profound enablers of true autonomous mobility. And what I mean by that is our ability to go from environments where, we have the advantage of a safety attendant on board to kind of serve as that emergency override, to truly unattended usage of these types of autonomous platforms. It's going to require that level of interface from a remote command and control environment, monitoring environment, oversight, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think that's been entirely understood or embraced. I will tell you from our seat in the stands, it's going to be the most critical bridge from where we are today to true, pervasive use of autonomous platforms, and 5G is going to be absolutely critical to, to that advancement.
Where to choose? This is the hard part about 5G. I think the thing that I'm most excited about for 5G is the reduced latency that this technology offers, which allows it, I think, to really become a critical tool for safety-related use cases, just as Joe mentioned, in a whole variety of transportation cases. To me, that's the most exciting. I realize it might not, sell the most cell phones or whatever it is, but I think, to me, the ability for this system and this network that, we've built over the last 50 plus years in the United States to be able to actually prevent death and injury on our roadway is really exciting. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity as far as I'm concerned. And I think the most important thing to me, especially with this technology, is the opportunity to use it for everyone. And so if we do it right, we don't have to, it's not just for people who are sitting in a car or people who are, happen to carry a 5G enabled cell phone, but, the capability exists with 5G that we can really bring safety to everyone who's using our roadways and our transportation systems. That's the exciting thing for me.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. This has been a fantastic discussion. Joe, Greg, thank you both so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
A big thank you again to both of our speakers for participating in today's event, and to all of you for tuning in for today's discussion. If you missed a part of the program or you would like to share it with a colleague, a recording of today's webinar will be available on demand on our website, ctia.org. You can also stay up to date on all the latest from the wireless industry by visiting our website or by following us on Twitter @CTIA. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.